right, so we'll begin with chapter 1 by looking at a review of anatomy and looking at the function of our different tissues and then looking at different organ systems and then also start going into homeostasis. So to first begin with our class, we're looking at physiology now, and so let's just get through what the general definition of physiology is. And so this is the study of biological function, and so how does the body work? So here we're going to look at mechanisms as to how it works, and then what's the normal function of cells. However, we'll also see throughout the semester at how changes are to abnormal functioning of cells, which is the category and study of pathophysiology. So we'll cover mostly what is normal, but then also talk about what's abnormal too. And then also, so physiology is very important because it helps to explain cause and effect sequences. So if we have low blood glucose levels, then why is it that we have our glucagon responding? Or if we have high circulating blood glucose levels, such as with diabetes, what's the problem with insulin? And all of these are derived from scientific experiments, most of which have started out in animal models such as rats, mice, monkeys, and have been translated into humans as well. So we'll look into our review of a human anatomy and start with the hierarchy of life. And this should be a simple review where we start out as cells. And so with the cell, this is going to be the basic unit of life, okay? And so that has the function of all living things. Then the next larger hierarchy then is the tissue. And so tissues are groups of similar cells that perform a similar function. And so if you remember, we have 4 different tissue types. We have epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular tissue. Then when we have groups of 2 or more tissues, then we go into organs. And so this has structural and functional units that perform a certain task. Then when we have several organs, we have an organ system, which is going to be a group of organs that work together to perform related function. And then finally, our 11 organ systems, which are going to make our organism, where all the organ systems are going to work together. So here in this image, this is a review of what type of tissue, first of all. Take a moment and then also think of what are properties of this tissue. And so this is skeletal muscle, and this is voluntary muscle that you have conscious control of, and it's mostly associated with bones that are pulled to produce different movements. A few of these do not cause skeletal movements, but they are under conscious control. So for example, the tongue, the esophagus, sphincters, and the diaphragm are all examples of that. Also, they have cells that are organized in striations with actin and myosin fibers. And then also we have the union of separate cells, which are called myoblasts, to form myofibers, which perform a synctum so that they all can work together. And then lastly, one of the properties of skeletal muscle is that it can produce a graded response so that these are excitable tissues as well. So now take a moment to look at this image, and so what is it and what are properties or functions of it? And so what you're looking at here, this is cardiac muscle, which is found only in the heart. Its fibers are short and branched, and they're also interconnected both physically and electrically. These are also striated, but are very different in structure and action as compared to skeletal muscle. These are involuntary because you cannot consciously control them. However, you can control the rate at which they do contract, but you can't control the actual method of them contracting. There are also specialized cell connections that are intercalated discs. And so here I'll highlight. Here we have the intercalated discs, so you can't see that. So here we go. So intercalated discs are right here. And so these allow passage of sodium ions between cells. And unlike skeletal muscle, these cannot produce a graded contraction, meaning it cannot get larger or more excitable with time. Okay, so now look at this and think of what are its functions. And so here we're looking at smooth muscle now. And so these line the walls of the digestive, urinary, and reproductive organs, also with blood vessels and the bronchioles of the lungs. These are not striated in appearance, and these too, just like cardiac muscle, are involuntary. And these have layers that run in opposite directions. And so this allows for peristalsis, which is coordinated wave-like contractions to move substances through our different organs. Okay, take a moment to look at this now, and then think about its structure and function. And so this is nervous tissue. So we find this within the brain, the spinal cord, and nerves. These are composed of neurons and glial cells. So this large structure we have here, so this would be part of the neuron, right? And then, so these little nuclei here actually will be part of the glial cells. So neurons conduct impulses, and they have three different parts. We have the dendrites here. And so these are short, highly branched, and cytoplasmic extensions that receive electrical signals. Then we have the cell body, which is typically this large feature. And here, this is where you find all the organelles, such as the nucleus, which is typically this large dot that we see. Also has other organelles like mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, and so on. And then lastly, we have the axon here. And so this is the long single extension that sends signals from this neuron further on to the next neuron. And so the neuroglial that we find surrounding neurons are the supporting cells that do not actually conduct a nerve impulse, but are essential for normal neuronal function. All right, so here take a look at this tissue and think of what are the functions of this. And so here we have, this is epithelial tissue. And so we have many different types or layers. So first is based on the number of layers. And so here we have one layer, so this is our simple. Here we have multiple layers, and so this would be our stratified. And then here it looks like it's multiple layers, but is really only one, so pseudo-stratified. And then we also have different shapes. So this one is squamous because it looks like a flat egg. Here we have cuboidal, as wide as it is tall. Here we have columnar. Okay. And so the epithelial tissues, these form the membranes that cover body surfaces and line the inside of hollow organs and glands. The membranes are also, so they're classified by number. So again, simple epithelium has one layer, and so this is special for transport of substances. So like, for instance, within our capillaries and then alveoli of the lungs for rapid gas exchange and of carbon dioxide and for oxygen. Stratified epithelium, this is where we have two or more layers. And so this is helps aid in protection. So we find this within our skin. And then we have classification by shape. So squamous will be the flattened cells that we see, and for allowing for rapid diffusion. Cuboidal are as tall as they are long, helps for reabsorption. So we find these along with the kidney tubules. And then columnar are tall cells. Typically, we have microvilli associated with them so that they aid in surface area and for reabsorption of different materials. And so you can put the cell shape together with the number of layers to name your epithelial tissue. And the last feature that we have is that epithelial tissue will be attached to connective tissue by some type of basement membrane. What about this? What are we looking at? What are functions of it? So this is now connective tissue. And so connective tissue in general has a matrix of protein fibers, extracellular matrix, and then specialized cells such as chondrocytes or osteocytes, depending on the function for that. And so there are two main types. There's going to be loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. So the loose connective tissue, these are collagen fibers that are scattered loosely with room for blood vessels and nerves, whereas the dense connective tissue are densely packed collagen fibers with little ground substance. And so here we're looking at dense regular connective tissue. And so here we have packed collagen fibers with little room for ground substance. And so the collagen fibers are these ones that we have here. Okay, and so what we're seeing though still here, these dark patches, those are still different nuclei of different cell types. And so examples of where we would find this in tendons and our ligaments. All right, so what about this? What are we looking at? So this is another type of connective tissue. Now we're looking at loose connective tissue. So this is adipose, which this is in particular is white adipose tissue, which we typically see with adulthood instead of with infancy. And the purpose of it is to store fat, and so the fat cells are called the adipocytes. And so the adipocytes, the cells of it, are actually squished here because of these large globular fat substances that we store adipose in. All right, so how about here? What is it and what is the purpose of it? And so these are connective tissue as well. And so here we're looking at osteoblasts that are trapped in mineral salts that are forming concentric layers of calcified materials around a canal that's filled with blood vessel and nerves. Okay, so here, for instance, would be the blood vessels and nerves. And so these are what is within our bones and also similarly within the dentin of our teeth. And what we have here, so the matrix has hardened and the cells are osteocytes and live in little spaces called the lacunae, which are going to be these right here. So again, the dentin in our tooth is similar to bone, and it's made of cells in the pulp, and so the outer enamel is truly, in fact, harder than bone or the dentin. So as a review, remember that we have 11 organ systems, and so you should be quite familiar with the different 11 types and then the main organs, but what are the main functions? This is now what we need to start focusing in on. So like with the integument system, it's to protect and to also regulate our bodies. The nervous system is regulation of other body systems and typically works with the endocrine system where they talk to one another. So then the endocrine system, big role of it is for secreting hormones and also production of hormones. The skeletal system so helps with movement and support and works together with our muscular system. Otherwise they would not function just alone. Also then we have our circulatory system. This helps to move blood and lymph along and also aids in exchange of gases. Our immune system is important for defending against foreign invaders. And then respiratory is important for gas exchange. And again, works with our circulatory system. Urinary helps with regulation of blood volume composition, but also has a significant effect on our circulatory system where those two will regulate one another. Digestive system, so breaking down of food and molecules and having nutrients entering the bloodstream. And then lastly, reproductive, which is important for continuation of us. Now we are going to start talking about the most important concept in terms of physiology. And so this is something that we will see over and over again, and it's homeostasis. So homeostasis is to maintain a constant internal environment. That is the purpose. Because when problems go wrong, this is when we have disrupted homeostasis and means that we might have some type of injury or some type of disease. And so we have different sorts of mechanisms where all those different organ systems and organs will work when needed in response to our body needs. And so some of it could be acute, lasting only seconds to minutes, but some may be long-term, lasting hours, days, and even months to help maintain a homeostatic condition. So deviations, yes, from homeostasis, this indicates diseases. So for instance, if you constantly have high blood glucose levels, high sugar levels, over time, this means that if these are maintained at high levels, you probably have diabetes mellitus. And so homeostasis is going to be accomplished most often by negative feedback loops, where it helps to decrease the response of some type of effector. But we also have another type called positive feedback loop, where it's important for something like blood clotting, where we want the effect to continue until it has completed its action. The pathway for homeostasis includes 3 different variables. The first being the sensor. And so the sensor is something within the body, so typically within an organ or within the brain, that detects changes and sends information then to the integration center. So the integration center then will assess the changes around a set point. And so that typically occurs within the brain or the spinal cord. So then that information from the integration center carries on to then the effector, where the effector will make changes to counter changes from the set point. And so these are going to be controlled either by cells within the organ, which is called intrinsic homeostasis, or will occur within the brain or other organs using the endocrine or nervous system. And so that would be via an extrinsic mechanism. All right, so next couple of slides we'll go into the different kinds of feedback for homeostasis. Let's begin first with negative feedback. And so here, let's look at negative feedback. And so this is where the mechanism moves in the opposite direction from the change. And so this makes the change from the set point smaller and reverses the change in the set point. This is a continuous process, so it means it's dynamic, and there's always fine adjustments that stay to maintain. So there will be some initial stimulus. So let's talk about body temperature. So if body temperature, say, is above normal, then we'll have something within the brain detecting deviations from our normal temperature, body temperature, which is around 37 degrees Celsius. So then another part of the brain, typically the hypothalamus, assesses this as an actionable response, and so then it's going to trigger into then the response, which is ultimately the effector. And so the effector then will increase the amount of sweat that's produced by our sweat glands, and then that will help to decrease then the stimulus of that high temperature, and this will continue on until we go back to normal body temperature. Positive feedback, which is shown in this figure, has an opposite effect, where the stimulus increases the amount of the response. And typically we don't see this very often in physiological conditions. However, there are certain times where we do see it. All right, so with this, what we have is that the end product is actually in a process that stimulates an increase in this process. So the action will increase the change that stimulated the effectors. So for instance, an example of positive feedback would be with blood clotting, okay? So the stimulus is that there's been some injury to a vessel or tissue, and that's going to recruit then some white blood cells to come in, and then also with other platelets and proteins to help begin the healing process. Well, the more white blood cells that we have is going to increase the stimulus, and so in essence, we'll have an increase then in recruitment of more white blood cells. And this response will continue until we have successfully finished whatever needs to occur. So in this case, once we've completed a blood clot. Another example of positive feedback would be with childbirth, where the stimulus is going to be the fetus pushing down on the uterus and on the cervix, and it's going to increase the amount of hormone release of oxytocin, and so that's going to continue until the fetus has exited out of the uterus. So here we'll begin with going through one more time with negative feedback. So here we'll have some type of stimulus, and this is going to detect anything that's abnormal from normal conditions. So anything that has offset homeostasis within our internal environment. And so we'll have some type of sensor send that information then to an integration center, and then have some type of an effector that's going to then elicit some type of response, okay? And so this will continue until the stimulus is no longer there, okay? So let's go through an example here. So when we have an increase in blood pressure, then we have the sensors, which are found within our aortic inner carotid sinuses, are going to then send that information to regulatory centers in the brain, which is in the medulla oblongata in this example. And then the effector then will be for the arterial walls to relax, and so that is going to then decrease our blood pressure, okay? And so once our blood pressure goes back to normal, then the stimulus is no longer there of the high blood pressure, and so the system will stop. And so there, again, with negative feedback, this is always in constant motion, and so we always are detecting even slight changes. So this might last for several seconds, it might last for minutes, days, hours, or sometimes even months. So examples that we see not only with blood pressure, but also temperature is going to be regulated with negative feedback. Blood pH is going to also be regulated, and then blood glucose levels would be also an example of how negative feedback controls our internal environment. So in this example, this is an example of positive feedback. And so let's go through labor and delivery. And so this is a great example of positive feedback. So during labor, a hormone called oxytocin is released, and so oxytocin here is going to increase and speed up contractions within the uterus, okay? And so another stimulus is that the baby pushing on the cervix, causing the uterus to stretch. So with then, both of these responses then will increase the contractions, okay, and this will cause even more oxytocin to be released within the brain, and so this cycle will continue until, and here we have increase in oxytocin, until the baby is born. And so birth ends the release of oxytocin, and thus will end the positive feedback mechanism.